Greetings. We are here to continue this course into lecture number 4 on the issue of the international dynamics of 1776 and 1865. As two pregnant moments, two very dense periods in world history, there's a statement that I believe it might have been Lenin who stated this, that there are times when decades go by where nothing substantial happens, and at other times, days that transpire where decades happen. And I would say that within these dense periods of history, which should be seen as a battle of ideas that either pertain to natural law or an offense to natural law, there are certain moments that should draw our attention forth. And 1776 and 1865 are among two of those dense saturated periods of potential that we will be looking at today that were not what contemporary history books have tended to paint them. And we're going to figure out why that is. In the course of my book series, my research on the clash of the two Americas, I made the point in my introduction of the first volume that the United States can be considered something that was more than you thought it was and less than it was meant to be. And I like that idea because it really introduces the free will aspect of things. It doesn't treat history as a dead, static thing where dates have been placed on a timeline, but it rather poses the question of history as something that we are currently living in and something which has been shaped by ideas that were fought for, that were died for, and that did or did not come into being in varying degrees. And in the case of the United States, the true story, which has drama, it has intrigue, it has tragedy, has not been told properly and has largely, and I would say intentionally, been obscured by forces that would prefer that we don't learn those lessons, which would help us recognize many parallels in the same principles operational today as those that were faced by leading figures of the 18th century. Again, that would pose the fact that it is less than it was meant to be. It was meant to be something greater than we have seen as a tragedy of an empire sitting or racing towards its own self-annihilation. But at the same time, there is something beautiful. And I would say when you look at when you investigate the events surrounding the murder of the 8 presidents who died while in office, and I would say murder, even though only 4 died by bullets, the other 4 other mysterious circumstances. In my investigations, and I think this could be shared by anybody who explores this the way I did, you could find that through the writings, the original writings, the speeches, the policies, the clashes with structures within Wall Street, Freemasonic operations that were behaving according to an interest far removed from the United States. In all cases, from William Harrison all the way to John F. Kennedy, we could find a common principle that was being acted upon by the great leaders of America who utilized an understanding of constitutional banking and a foreign policy perspective that saw other nations as in need of support to stand on their own 2 feet and not to be subdued under a new empire. One question I would like to pose here before we begin is what caused 1776? There are many theories about the motivations of those founding fathers and what accounted for this anomaly to emerge at the time that it did, where 13 colonies made up principally of farmers was able to throw off the shackles of control of the world's largest, most powerful empire, the British Empire. So what allowed that to happen? Now, there's some popular explanations that try to brush it away with overly simplistic answers, and one of the big ones is was it the desire to not pay taxes, otherwise known as taxation without representation? Was it a tea party? Was it the right to control slave profits? We know that there were a lot of slaves, and they did make a lot of profits for their slave owners. Was it simply that certain people didn't want to share in their earnings? with perhaps taxes that were going to a overbearing mother country? Was it D, the desire to create a new Roman Empire? Could it be that these farmers actually had the ambition to go and replace the British Empire and reconstitute the Roman Empire? Some say yes. And the basis of that proof is simply that people look at the way America has come to behave in the past century as a Pax Americana, and they then extrapolate in a linear way the behavior of the present circumstances of an imperial America and extend that interpretation all the way back into the founding days and even before. I would say that that's naive and wrong, but that is a popular explanation which we cannot ignore. Another one that's become quite popular is that it was a Rothschild banker's operation to overthrow monarchies for better control over the world. Let's not ignore that one right now, but again, I don't believe that's actually taking proper evidence into consideration, though it is also becoming quite popular to say this as well. The last one I included here is a global conspiracy to usher in a society founded upon justice, wisdom, and cooperation. If you hadn't guessed, my heart definitely, after years of research, tends to increasingly resonate with that last answer more than all of the others. And we're going to see why that is the case. Let me read that again. A global conspiracy to usher in a society founded upon justice, wisdom, and cooperation. Let's look at the American Declaration of Independence that was made public in 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, I don't think anyone, except perhaps the most cynical of us, would look at these words and say these were wrong necessarily. In fact, I think most people would agree that these were very beautiful. I would only say that most people, my old self included, who grew up in a Canadian school system, believing that America was always an empire and that's all it could ever be, the, most people would probably believe that these beautiful, principled words were just ink on parchment with no meaning and were perhaps just a hypocritical cover for a corrupt empire waiting to grow in influence. That I would say is not a reason why people die. Or that's not why they die. That's not why they risk their lives for the sake of something that is simply going to be a new corrupt empire. That isn't what is going to awaken a sense of righteous feeling of fighting for justice, even to the point of risking the safety and security and lives of yourself and your family, which is what so many farmers had done during the early days of the American Revolution. But there was something there that I think stands true and goes. The ideals that were outlined by the figures of Plato, of great Christian humanists like St. Augustine, even before that, like Cicero within his laws and his Commonwealth, or St. Augustine's City of God, as being the concept that human beings will only be our true selves when we begin to learn to create laws that are in harmony with God's law. And to the degree that we create laws that are an infringement of God's law, that is an infringement of justice, a destruction of the personal liberty of the individual, then we will always cyclically fall back into systems of empire, enslavement, dark ages, collapse, and war. So I believe that this falls into a deeper continuity of history and a manifestation of something that had spent centuries, if not millennia, underground, but only here at this moment capable of really shaping the political system in a real way that created a new nation. And again, to be reminded that America in 1774, 1775, when this document was being drafted, looked very different. We had simply 13 colonies that were English speaking, an Indian country generally managed by the English. Most of the continent was Spanish possession, which we see there in yellow. And then obviously the province of Quebec, which was British controlled since the British had dominated and defeated the French in the Seven Years' War and had come out as the undisputed alpha of the empires of the world out of 1763. So this is the environment in which this is occurring. And people would say, oh, but the hypocrites that made this idea that all men are created equal, didn't they all have slaves? Wasn't it a slave empire? Well, if we actually just simply take a look at the facts, what we can see is that was not the case. By 1784, 6 states in the new nation had voted to totally abolish slavery, including Rhode Island in 1774, Vermont in 1777, Pennsylvania in 1780, Massachusetts in 1781, New Hampshire in 1783, and Connecticut in 1784, while the importation of all new slaves was banned by every other state by 1793. The important Northwest ordinances passed in the 1787 Continental Congress, which created the Constitution of the United States, ensured that no slavery would be permitted in the immense Northwest territories, giving rise to the later addition of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And it was also enunciated in 1774 by the Non-Importation Act of Slaves that was signed by all colonies, saying that we will neither import nor purchase any slave imported after the first day of December next, after which time we will wholly discontinue the slave trade, and will neither be concerned in it ourselves, or will we hire our vessels, or sell our commodities or manufactures to those who are concerned in it. Now, again, I'm saying this just because it has been so popular in today's age to promote the idea that America is entirely a slave society, and that is at the heart of the Antifa movement, Black Lives Matter, and other things that have become increasingly anarchist movements capable of creating great havoc on behalf of those with much money and much political power who are able to direct these color revolutionary operations within American soil itself. And the indoctrination process involved a redefining of history around the notion that American slavery is still, it's systemic, it's embedded in the white race per se, which must dominate the weak, those races that and genders that are not dominant must be suppressed by the white European rich males. And all that to say, this theory is outright wrong. It is based on lies, and the evidence, as I just outlined, demonstrates that there was a real intention to break free of the addiction to slavery. Why was there an addiction to slavery? Well, because, as we see with this map, America, the colonies were part for a very long time. They were part of a much larger British Empire, which by 1775 had grown to the extent seen there in the map in front. And one of the consequences of the British Empire since at least 1618, when the British Royal Africa Company began to infuse slaves from Africa into its colonies in the Americas, was a program that was designed to destroy manufacturing or any aspiration of the young colonies, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Connecticut, or any other colony. Anytime that there was an effort to create manufacturing, to begin to stand on one's own 2 feet, such as was seen with the Sawgus Iron Works of Massachusetts, it was crushed by the British Empire, and none other than John Locke, who was a director of the Royal Africa Company and made a fortune importing black slaves from Africa, of which over 8 million counted between 1618 and 1775, imported directly. This individual passed laws, drafted laws that forbade the colonies anywhere from having manufacturing. meaning there was an economy wired to slavery by design by the British Empire. And those colonists who were the orchestrators, the architects of the Declaration of Independence and the battle against this empire were in total moral opposition to that for the most part. Now, I'm not saying that it didn't continue or that there wasn't corrupt people who built up a greater virulent evil slave power. However, at the time of the revolution, it was on its way out. And the figure of Benjamin Franklin played an important role in that. There is him in the French courts after he was made ambassador of the United States to France, where he began to organize not just the French who take part in supporting the American cause of liberty, but also he began organizing, or had, I shouldn't say began because he had already been doing that, but he increased his power of organization of other leading figures from around Europe, including Russia and even India and North Africa, to support cause of liberty with the idea that a new age of brotherhood and cooperation founded upon reason, that is moral reason, not just logic, but moral reason of all humankind made in the image of a living creator, could finally blossom. Um, and the idea, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, which must be reemphasized, his discoveries in 1752-53 of electricity that allowed for an insight that all men are created in the image of a reasonable creator who didn't simply make creation to lord over us and to destroy our villages through electrical fires, forest fires, and storms of chaos as acts of vengeance for our sins, as was thought by many, but rather was something to be discovered. And as we discovered, evermore God's creation would become something that could serve our needs, as we saw with the new inventions that the discovery of Ben Franklin was able to open up. And as such, the ability of humankind to leap over the limits of growth was ever more perfect. And our ability to sustain more people at a higher quality of life was also improved. Now, Ben Franklin's insight also into not just political economy, which he outlined in his Society, or his essays concerning the increase of mankind in 1751, justifying the importance to always increase human growth, quality and quantity alike, by actualizing and building the powers of creativity. That was also tied to his insight that all human beings, including black and yellow and red and every color in between, had this similar ability, if given the opportunity and the culture, to make pioneering discoveries and improvements to themselves and to society as a whole. As such, we shouldn't be surprised to find that Benjamin Franklin, as the primary uh, controller of printing presses in America, was also printing the earliest tracts educating people about the evils of slavery as early as 1736, and was the co-founder of the Society for the Manumission of Slaves in 1785, which had as its constitution some remarks which outlined that the benevolent creator and father of all men, having given them all an equal right to life, liberty, and property, no sovereign power on earth can justly deprive them of either, but in conformity to impartial government and laws, which they have expressly or tacitly consented. So now let's take a step back and see, well, what really was needed to make 1776 a success? And of course, the success was manifest at the uh, final battle in 1781 and was legally recognized in 1783 at the Treaty of Paris, the Peace of Paris. Well, unlike popular history books that tried to paint this as something that occurred between the British Empire and the United States, in my book series, as well as the many films and videos that I've produced, um, a much more elegant global dynamic, a much bigger global chemistry was at play. And the reality of that global top-down chemistry that involved players operating from Morocco to India to Russia, all the way even into some Spanish American territories, cannot be understood if one keeps the mind locked into the cage of a narrative that posits that we can only look at American British dynamics. And we're going to see now some examples of what I'm talking about. Here we have three prominent figures who I think showcase this international dynamic on a certain level, representing the France, Poland, and Prussia. Marquis de Lafayette, who came in 1777 with hundreds of French freedom-loving aristocrats who even broke their own laws by deciding to risk their lives to fight in this American cause, was only later joined by France years later, that came in to turn the tides of the war in favor of the Americans at a precarious moment in 1780. But he had come in much earlier and had risen to become a world respected hero, in a very important way. We had Colonel Tadeusz Kosciuszko, who was the brigadier general in the Continental Army and somebody who was representing a Republican spirit and a high Renaissance outlook of Poland. And many other Polish patriots came down to as well fight against the British Empire in the colonies. Wilhelm von Steuben was made by Washington the Inspector General of the Continental Army, representing Prussia. And many, many Prussian troops and soldiers came in with ranks as high as general of the Continental Army. And even the Continental Army itself, a name of 1774, should also cause us to think, well, what was a bigger idea beyond simply not wanting to pay taxes without representation, which was, by the way, only, I think, item number 17 of a much longer list on the Declaration of Independence of grievances that were much, much more palpable and principled than simply greed to have more of your money and income in your pocket. That is not why people create a revolution of this sort. Another point, I mentioned Russia. Well, these are portraits of Tsarina Catherine the Great and her friend and ally Ekaterina Deshkova as architects of the League of Armed Neutrality of 1780. And this League of Armed Neutrality, I would say, was one of the most important of the decisive programs that again shifted the entire contour of the United States, or of the War of Independence, and that was led by Russia, which essentially was a maneuver against the British, which had full control or the dominance over the maritime trade routes, and was consistently blocking ships, raiding ships from Russia, from Denmark, from Sweden, from the Netherlands, from Spain, from France, obviously, from providing support to the colonists who would otherwise wish to purchase grains, food, supplies, weapons, and all of that to say that finally these programs to block support was bypassed when the League of Armed Neutrality came together, which was a message to the British that if they tried to stop a ship, let's say, carrying supplies to America, that was Russian, then they would be facing a direct conflict with Russia. Also, as a noteworthy point here, Ekaterina Deshkova was also the president of the Russian Academy of Sciences, an institution that was directly outlined by the figure of Gottfried Leibniz, who we met in lecture number 1 and who we will meet further in future lectures, who was a close advisor, a privy counselor to Tsar Peter the Great, and a major legal reformer of Russia, and in fact somebody who inspired the expedition that Peter the Great launched before he died, that sent the figure of Bering to the Bering Sea to explore what became both the Alaska side of the American continent, as well as Russia, discovering the Bering Strait and broader Russian Alaskan territory, founding what later becomes Russian Alaska, which plays a big part in our story, as especially we will see with the international dynamics of 1865. So Ekaterina Dashkova was a female, a reformer of the Academy of Sciences, a close friend and ally of Benjamin Franklin, whom she met in Europe, and who was the key in bringing and orchestrating the League of Armed Neutrality with Catherine the Great herself. She was made by Benjamin Franklin the first Russian member of Benjamin Franklin's Philosophical Society, and in turn, Benjamin Franklin was made the first American member of the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1780 as well. So, just at a very important, interesting point that I think historians should probably look at with fresh eyes. Here we have a painting of Admiral Suffren, who was meeting Hyder Ali in 1780. What you have on the left is a map featuring Mysore of southern India, a Muslim-dominated area of southern India, which was the greatest freedom-loving area in opposition to British controls and which were attempting to get total dominance of India, as was unfortunately made the case after Hyder Ali and his son especially were defeated eventually. But they carried out some of the most heroic, impressive battles that we know of during that time of freedom against the empire. And through the channels of Benjamin Franklin, once again, the French had a lot of connections with Hyder Ali and his son, Tipu Sultan, and organized a collaboration, a harmonization where Hyder Ali launched an attack to expel the British Empire, which went on for years, beginning in 1780, in a concerted effort. And what we have in 1781 was, and I miswrote it, I wrote 1881 by accident, but it was 1781 that his son Tipu Sultan wrote to the Continental Congress stating that every blow that is struck in the cause of American liberty throughout the world, in France, India, and elsewhere, and so long as a single insolent, savage tyrant remains, the struggle shall continue. Tipu Sultan continues in this letter, really outlining that your fight is our fight. We have one, even though one side is coming from a Christian matrix, the other from a Muslim matrix, there was an understanding that we are all human first, and as humans, we resist empire, we resist tyranny for the sake of freedom. And in gratitude, because this was no small thing. In fact, this battle in India forced the British to redirect approximately 20% of their naval fleets to attempt to suppress the Indian uprisings, which was an extremely important aspect to shifting the weight in favor of the American colonists fighting. And in gratitude, the first American battleship after the War of Independence was won was named the Hyder Ali. And here is actually a mural that exists even to this day in NASA's, in the NASA headquarters, which features a painting of rockets, the very first rockets used in warfare, which were rockets made by Hyder Ali's scientific military allies who built these long-range missiles that could go upwards of a kilometer in distance and strike their targets to devastating effect, ravaging British troops, which we see just getting exploded there in the painting. And it was only years later that the British figured out finally how to reverse engineer these rockets and begin using them for their benefit. They stole them from Indian freedom fighters as a technology, and that's another important irony that's been lost in history. It wasn't just Hyder Ali and the Indian Mysore uprising, however. We also have Emperor Sidi Mohammed of Morocco, who had organized through, again, French channels operational within embassies of Morocco, an alliance with the United States. And as such, the basis of the alliance was for Emperor Sidi to protect American ships that were otherwise being attacked by Barbary pirates of Algeria, Tunisia, and elsewhere, that largely were under the service and beholden to the interests of the British Empire and the British East India Company, which would often use proxies, as we see with ISIS being used to this day, or Nazis in Kiev being used by as proxies by a higher power to do a battle with an enemy, and that was how the Barbary pirates were also used in many cases, except for Emperor Sidi Muhammad, who said no, and he protected many American ships in precarious waters around the Straits of Gibraltar. He was also the first nation of the world to recognize America, the 13 colonies, as a legitimate independent nation in 1777. And that friendship was extremely important and built up through very careful diplomacy by Benjamin Franklin once again, to the point that Franklin was part of a committee, including John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, which stated a resolution put forth in the Continental Congress of 1784, which resolved that a commission be issued to Mr. J. Adams, Mr. Ben Franklin, and Mr. Thomas Jefferson, giving powers to them to make and receive propositions for such treaties of amity and commerce, and to negotiate and sign the same, transmitting them to Congress for their final ratification, and that such commission be in force for a term not exceeding 2 years. Now, this was specifically in regards to creating a special relationship between Morocco and the USA, and unfortunately, due to certain intrigue launched by forces that were treacherous within the young republic, this was abandoned, and America was enmeshed in its first ugly war with the North African countries, including Morocco, in later years, called the American Barbary Wars. That is a sad derailment, but again, history, as pointed out in the previous lecture, should be understood as a battle over futures that did or did not come into being. And that definition, I think, of history is a very potent one to see what were the ideas and why were they sabotaged, who were the players who played either a nefarious role or who was simply tragic, who could have done better, who should have done better, but was cowardly or incompetent when they needed to be a better person, who were the Hamlets that could have protected Denmark from the oncoming attacks of Fortinbras, and who instead were too enmeshed within their own petty concerns. They allowed their nation to fall, as Hamlet had done. Another international dynamic to keep in mind, although China didn't participate in the American revolutionary cause, Benjamin Franklin was a great admirer of China, as was Leibniz earlier. And Benjamin Franklin was the first of the American educators to publish through his printing presses the writings of Confucius, the Analects and the Classics for an English-speaking audience in the colonies. And this goes back to the 1740s that he began doing this. And he fought very hard to encourage as many of those revolutionaries that he could develop and nurture to try to study the Confucian meritocratic system, which he wished to be the foundation of the new society he was bringing into being. He also said when he was asked, who are your heroes? How do you organize your life? And he said in response that I emulate Jesus, Socrates, and Confucius. So Benjamin Franklin was not just a Platonist, he was a Confucian, which do go together quite nicely when you look at the writings of people like Matteo Ricci or Confucius or Mencius themselves. One can see very common, the exact same principles of natural law, but in the form of Tianming, the mandate of heaven, as the same formulation as was developed by Gottfried Leibniz or Augustine earlier around the city of God. So that's another just quick example that without this international support and global dynamics, I can say irrefutably that the aspirations laid out in the Declaration of Independence and the further constitution that the society should be created, founded upon the general welfare, the consent of the governed, and the rejection of hereditary systems of rule of might makes right, that never would have succeeded. So let's just jump ahead to our second pregnant moment of today's lesson. which begins in this case. I chose 1863 and the theme of how Russia saved the United States. Once again, the Civil War is something often treated as a purely American phenomenon. That is, if one chooses to adopt that perspective, treating it as though it's simply about slave states versus free states, or even simply banking and who's going to control the banking procedures. In all of those cases, that simply treats this as an American phenomenon will not understand what made the Civil War happen, let alone what allowed the Union, what allowed the Patriots around Abraham Lincoln to come out victorious instead of seeing the nation dissolve and the successes of 1776 undone. And again, with the big trick within this uh, process that changed the course of history once again was Russia. Just the same way that Russia played such a big role in saving America during its first days, 1776, so too did Russia step in once again. Now, the Russians themselves had suffered their own traps that were laid by the British and their junior partners of the French imperialists and Ottomans that were able to induce Russia to foolishly get sucked into a wasting war, very costly. Many, many died. Russia came out nearly bankrupt over this 3-year war begun in 1853, and that only finally ended in 1856, known as the Crimean War. Now, certain short-sighted Russians were too soft-minded to recognize the trap for what it was. Others perhaps had some imperial ambition to think that a weakening Ottoman Empire would be easy pickings for those who wished to expand and consolidate their territories down further into Egypt, the Middle East, and beyond. All that to say, it was a plot and it backfired devastatingly, such that when uh, the new Tsar came into power, Nicholas II, Alexander II in 1856, there was a recognition that a major reform needed to happen all across Russia and beyond. Before I go into the reforms of Russia that had occurred under the new leadership of Alexander II, I would like to say something a little bit more about the battle lines between Lincoln and his enemies operational within the American continent. The structure and nature of the battle lines was outlined, I think, very well by Lincoln in a debate against Stephen Douglas, his opponent for the candidacy then of the Senate and eventually the presidency, where in 1858, October 15th, he noted that the battle lines very, very nicely, where he said that this is the issue that will continue in this country when those poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent. It is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right, wrong, throughout the world. They are the two principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle. One is the common right of humanity, and the other, the divine right of kings. So again, Lincoln is putting forth his understanding that the issue of slavery, which Douglas represents, of the idea that someone's freedom can be owned by another human being, is co-equivalent in principle to the issue of divine right of kings, which was the idea of hereditary power that was justifying the system of oligarchical empires all over the world and had been from the earliest records that we know of. And he properly situates the battle against global empire, global colonialism, with the battle against slavery as the same thing, and that it is. And many people say that, oh, Lincoln didn't really fight the war over slavery. He didn't care about slavery, and often a certain letter is cited again and again where Lincoln had written to Horace Greeley some comment about how if he could stop the war without freeing any slaves, he would stop the war and he wouldn't free any slaves. Um, Now, that's said without any context and ignoring the fact that going back to his earliest days as a lawyer in Illinois and a congressman, working with John Quincy Adams in opposition to the U.S. Mexican War, a war of empire, an immoral, evil war of the U.S. getting sucked into a very vicious battle of acquisition of territory. He stood up against that and fought against it and tried everything and in fact did stop that war through his spot speeches. But he was always openly advocating ending slavery, was always an enemy of the slave system. And so simply that one quote out of context completely derails the issue of his whole life being devoted openly to stopping slavery, which was why when he was elected, it was seen as an act of war by the slave states who knew that that is exactly what he was going to do at some point, which was why they seceded and declared war, shooting the first shots, resulting in the Civil War itself. A similar principle, as we saw with the Emancipation Proclamation, was also seen in in the words of Tsar Alexander II as soon as he took power, where he said to the marshals of nobility that you can yourself understand that the present order of owning souls cannot remain unchanged. It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for that time when it starts to abolish itself from below. I ask you to think about the best way to carry this out. And so we already have Tsar Alexander II, who is coming to be known as the great liberator for freeing the 25 million serfs that were the property of feudal landlords of the old aristocracy of Russia, who only a year later was joined by Abraham Lincoln, who freed the slaves of the U.S. colonies. Now, one could say, why was it after 80 years earlier, there was so much that was done to stop slavery? New slaves, there was laws that forbade the import of new slaves. Many states had committed to ending slavery completely. So why was this such an issue? Well, to answer this question, we have to realize that the slave power made a vengeful return, especially under the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, who was a very weak man in many ways. It's when he had good influence, he did good things, but he was somebody who detested industry. He believed, he followed John Locke, he believed in Adam Smith, and he believed in all of the theories that asserted that with industry comes immorality, and with immorality comes decadence and destruction and chaos. And so he equated manufacturing, people living in urban cities, as being the worst plague of society that had to be stopped. Now, how would this immorality be stopped in Jefferson's mind? Well, ironically, by keeping America underdeveloped, stuck on simply making money by exporting tobacco and cotton and wheat and nothing else. Nothing else. Now, of course, to do that required that America remain beholden to the system, or addicted, I should say, to the system of slave labor. And who was more than happy to oblige growing that incentive for making money off of slave exports? Well, if we look throughout the 19th century before the Civil War, the British Empire was the primary purchaser of American cotton produced from slave plantations, as well as tobacco, to the point that 80% of America's cotton outputs, which made the southern slave owners very rich, was purchased by the British Empire for their textile mills, which were also the dominant near monopoly of global textiles, simply because the British were so successful in destroying Hyder Ali and the Indian resistance movement and coming in with the British Empire and systematically destroying all of India's textile manufacturing, cutting off the hands of skilled workers in order to ensure that India would become dependent and would no longer be able to produce for itself, keeping in mind its GDP was among the highest of the world, far, far above even the British Empire at the turn of the 18th century, the 19th century, 1799, 1800. And we could see that GDP collapsing dramatically by the systematic destruction of the Indian economy under the British. And the same thing happened to the Chinese, who unfortunately suffered a similar fate. And what was done was a global system controlled by an executive authority in London. It could control the world through banking. Just like today, the city of London is a world nerve center of global banking. Their branches in the Cayman Islands launder money to this very day, including much of the drug money, the narco-terrorist money that's kept off the budgets and supporting the growth of speculative bubbles and black markets. That's again facilitated, and I would even say directed by the city of London high initiates, just like it was 200 years ago. And so the way the empire would always work would be to keep nations addicted to maritime exports and imports, not developing internally through rail developments or internal development of any sort, to keep everyone cash cropping so no one could have full spectrum economies. And that way, India was told, well, you produce the opium. Your climate is good for that. And the opium will get you money, which will be sold to the Chinese. The Chinese have tea. They'll produce that. And they will buy the opium that will destroy their vitality, will make them more corrupt, create the basis of organized crime syndicates that will become the fifth columnists loyal to the British Empire within Shanghai, within Hong Kong, within Macau. And that way, this once powerful great nation of 5,000 years would be subdued in what became the century of humiliation and the two opium wars. Now, those textiles that India once had will now be controlled entirely by London, and London will have the power of transforming raw materials into wealth that will use the cotton from the South, which will not industrialize. And as such, because it doesn't industrialize, it will be forced to use more and more slave labor. Now, where did the slaves come from if no new slaves are being brought into the United States? How are they growing? How are they multiplying? Because at the beginning of the Civil War, there were upwards of 6 million slaves. Where did these slaves? They were bred like horses. They were bred like cattle through slave market purchases, and families were broken up in a terrible way. And this is the type of thing that Lincoln was disgusted with, as were the best of American patriots. So there were two confederacies that the British were building up to undermine the Union. Number one, you had the Confederacy of the South that was provided support, financial support, logistic support when the war was begun, and directives. Battleships were built by the British for the Confederate South, but also the Northern Confederacy too. There was a Confederacy of the North, and that is something that we saw with what became the province of Canada. That was not yet, but it would soon be confederated into a new nation. And what you see there in green was a private Hudson Bay land, or Rupert's Land, which is the private Hudson Bay Company. We have Northwest Territories, and New Caledonia, or what was otherwise known as British Columbia, was isolated on the far Pacific coast, far removed from the other British territories on the continent. Now, this also became a zone where the British granted access to the Confederates to set up intelligence service headquarters in Montreal, in Toronto, in Kingston, Ontario, which were used to carry out warfare against the Union from the North during the Civil War. That's something that not many people know about, but it is very important, to the point that even John Wilkes Booth was sent to Canada to receive directions, and was sent back down after 4 weeks, where he described how he lost track of time and didn't even realize where he was, as he wrote to a family member before going off to shoot and murder Lincoln, only to disappear, his body never having been found. However, we do know that a $500 bank order was found in his possession, signed by Henry Starnes, who was the president of the Bank of Ontario, a high-level Freemason, and somebody who was rewarded by becoming the mayor of Montreal in 1865. We also know that this North American Act, the Northern Confederacy, which succeeded, where the Southern Confederacy against the Republic failed, was founded upon British principles. One of the acts of 1867, when this was passed into law, basically defined this new country around a deep state. And the idea was a new country would be set up not as its own republic, as some patriotic Canadians had wished, but rather as a society forever obedient to the systems of hereditary power, a privy councillor, governor generals, and unelected powers that would control the elected component of the government. And it says here in the preamble of the Canadian Constitution of 1867, whereas the provinces of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick have expressed their desire to be federally united into one dominion under the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, with a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. And whereas such a union would conduce to the welfare of the provinces and promote the interests of the British Empire, strange wording for a constitution, but there it is, be it therefore enacted and declared by the Queen's most excellent majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Lords spiritual and temporal, and commons in this present Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same as follows. Wherein, if one continues to read, like I said, the principles of law are organized around a monarch that has given those rights to the subjects and that can thus take them away whenever expedient, and privy council of officers who represent the powers of the throne of the Crown of England are going to be instituted, including lieutenant governors in each of the provinces, to give royal assent to anything that is going to become a law, or could inversely prevent laws from coming into being if they run contrary to the interests of the British Empire, which is the purpose of the nation, as it says. And this constitution is still active to this day, unfortunately. Again, a point which flows from the previous lecture on the issue of Canada that I want to bring about before going into Russia's relationship with America and how Russia saved America again, is the figure of Jefferson Davis, the man who would have been president of the Confederacy, the pro-British Confederacy, where he says, I hope, speaking to a Montreal audience or a Quebec audience of Canada on July 1867, saying, I hope that you will hold fast to their British principles and that you may ever strive to cultivate close and affectionate connections with the mother country. So he's saying this because he's demonstrating his own love and adoration of the British principles, even though he is celebrated by many Americans even today as being a great American patriot who fought against the tyrant Lincoln for the sake of the Constitution and principles of the Declaration of Independence, which was absurd since this man was also overseeing a new Confederate Constitution, which, if one reads what that Constitution was of the Confederacy, called for abolishing, making it illegal to ever free a slave forever. It also demanded that the new government be forever obedient to British free trade legally, and that it outlaws the creation at any time of internal improvements or national credit through a national bank, which was exactly what Abraham Lincoln had done through his greenbacks and his buildup of a national banking system founded upon the principles of national banking and national credit, which we'll see more in future presentations. Now, the second pregnant moment that I want to really go through here will as follows. Ambassador Stokel is a long-standing Russian ambassador to Washington, D.C., where he wrote to Gorchakov, I believe, the foreign minister of Russia in 1860, where he says that the disintegration of the United States as a nation would, from our point of view, be something to be deplored. The American Confederation has acted as a counterpoise to British power, and in this sense, its continued existence constitutes an important element in the balance of power. He continued that, Stoker continued that he desired the preservation of the American Union as an indivisible nation. So this should probably be repeated to Americans today, many of whom are drunk on hegemony and believe that it were best to not respect the idea of territorial integrity of any nation, and especially Russia, which they would prefer to see carved up into ethnic, ethno-nationalist federations under the control of the IMF today. Now, Russia went out of its way to ensure a policy of guaranteeing, of fighting for indivisible national integrity to America while it was going into clearly a new war. And Stokel, with American allies, especially Cassius Clay, Lincoln's chosen ambassador to Russia, was able to organize certain very important strategic policies that were reflective of the same thing that Russia and France had done for the young America in 1780, which was featured here in this one image of several major battleships being sent by Russia. This is the Russian fleet commanded by Admiral Lizovsky, being sent to the harbor of New York. And here's a reception of the Common Council Committee by Admiral Lizovsky on board of the flagship Alexander Nevsky, the name of the primary flagship of the Russian Navy sent to New York. And here's a procession of the Russian visitors through Broadway. They were celebrated as heroes by the Americans. And this is 1863. A similar grouping of battleships were sent by Russia to the Pacific coast as well, where they harbored in San Francisco off of California, in California. And the message was very clear that Russia would not accept official British and French military entry into the war. It was enough that the British were already supporting the Confederacy, both of the North and also of the South, clandestinely, but to do so openly as they were threatening with over 10,000 British troops, or is it 20,000 British troops stationed in Canada, waiting for the order to go and invade from the north to attack Lincoln, and thousands of French troops stationed in Mexico, where Emperor Maximilian was giving them protection and waiting for the order to direct French troops to go north and support the Confederate South openly in the war against Lincoln. That was something which Russia said, if you do, this will be war with Russia. So this happened at a very important moment when America was very weak. The banks of Wall Street were preventing Lincoln from accessing the credit needed to pay for the armies to basically do battle. And there was also speculative attacks against the American dollar run by London, Wall Street, and Canadian banks that were wishing the US would financially fail so that they would not be able to defend themselves in the war. And it was only at this time that Russia came in that you also had, in 1862, the solution that was adopted by Lincoln to create greenbacks, to begin issuing bills of credit through the acts of Congress, through the Treasury, and specifically Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution that gave the right of the nation to coin money and credit for things that are activities in the general welfare. This will be a much, much more greatly developed in a future course on the American system. Lincoln began this with his greenbacks, as I mentioned, as well as 520 bonds that would mature with 5% interest in 20 years that every citizen could purchase. And this became how Lincoln was able to bypass the stranglehold of the London Wall Street banking cartels that favored, in fact, the breakup of the Union. And Tsar Alexander II delivered a speech to Wharton Barker, who is a American journalist and banker, which was published in a few places, and the one I found was in the Independent newspaper of March 24th, 1904, where Tsar Alexander II had outlined his own motive for sending the Russian military, the Navy, to support America. And he says, and he describes this in the autumn of 1862, the governments of France and Great Britain posed to Russia in a formal but not an unofficial way the joint recognition by European powers of the independence of the Confederate States of America. My immediate answer was, I will not cooperate in such action, and I will not acquiesce. On the contrary, I shall accept the recognition of the independence of the Confederate States by France and Great Britain as a casus belli for Russia, and in order that the governments of France and Great Britain may understand that this is no idle threat, I will send a Pacific fleet to San Francisco and an Atlantic fleet to New York. All this I did because of love for my own dear Russia. I acted thus because I understood that Russia would have a more serious task to perform if the American Republic, with advanced industrial development, were broken up and Great Britain could be left in control of most branches of modern industrial development. Very insightful that he recognized that to fight global empire, you needed to have, and to be a sovereign country required industrial power, especially considering as well, at this early time, 25 million newly freed serfs was not an easy task, but a great challenge for Russia, because how do you create an economy that will give people who never knew freedom or never knew literacy, the training, the new identity, the higher culture that would make them active, participating citizens, and that would be able to just absorb that quantity of people into some form of economy. So you needed industry to be created very quickly. You needed transportation, internal improvements that would drive the development of these new industries in the same way that Leibniz had earlier been commissioned to generate a battle plan in 1711, 1712 for Russia. This was the same challenge advanced even further to cultivate the minds, the morals, the souls, and the bodies of these new people and make them productive citizens. Lincoln had something very similar as a challenge, as well as his followers who survived him. And keep in mind, both Alexander II and Lincoln himself were both martyred by operations, assassins that were deployed by in the case of Alexander II, anarchist operations in his case that were tied to Prince Kropotkin, somebody who thought of himself as the heir of the Rurik dynasty and rightful claimant to the throne and power of Russia. That same anarchist controller who interfaced with British intelligence, or in the case of Lincoln, it was another British-directed operation in the form of the broader conspiracy that resulted in Lincoln's murder, that John Wilkes Booth was but one part. So Lord Gascoigne Cecil, who would become Prime Minister of England 3 times, gave a speech during the Civil War where he noted that the northern states of America never can be our shore friends because we are rivals. Rivals politically, rivals commercially. With the southern states, the case is entirely reversed. The population are an agricultural people. They furnish the raw materials of our industry, and they consume the products which we manufacture from it. With them, every interest must lead us to cultivate friendly relations, and when the war began, they at once recurred to England as their natural ally. Again, very useful for just simply showcasing where England stood officially in its position towards the Confederate South, and how it saw that the Confederate South, having rejected industry, being reliant on simply agriculture and slavery, was a perfect ally and friend of England, whereas the North, which embraced industry, protectionism, and rejected slavery, could not be an ally of England. That same England that celebrates its own abolition of slavery in the 1830s as something that made it morally superior to the United States, which in fact had a sleight of hand behind it. Here I'm going to race ahead because we are now entering the point where the war is beginning to shift, and it's becoming clear that Lincoln will be victorious after all through the support of Russia. And a series of events, which I'm going to showcase on this somewhat timeline, um, indicate an extremely dense period of battles behind the scenes. And we are looking at the shadows of those physical principles, those clashes, the battles over two different ideas of the future. And I'm going to list them now. And I want people to think about the drama behind each one. And if you want to really know it, read my books. But here we go. As it was becoming clear that the war was going to end in the favor of the Union, although 500,000 men had died during the war. It was a vicious war, but finally it was coming to a conclusion. April to May of 1865, Lincoln is assassinated in April by John Wilkes Booth. I mentioned the operation run by British intelligence operations in Canada. 4 people were hung for the broader conspiracy to murder Lincoln, but many more were involved who were not punished. 1867, March 29th, British North America Act is enacted. A day later, March 30th, 1867, Alaska is purchased from the Russians by Secretary of State William Seward, a firm believer in manifest destiny. Those 2 dates are not a coincidence. There was a race for Canada and who could keep control of Canada at this precarious moment. March 1867, again, first British Columbia annexation movement petition for leaving the British Empire and joining America is presented to Queen Victoria. So that's a very, very dense month. That's annexation petition. I mentioned the earlier case of the solo isolated colony of British Columbia. They were suffering through debt, unpayable debts, a destroyed economy. Their only economy was really based on fur trades, the fur trade, as well as a gold rush, which turned into a bomb, a speculative bomb, and ghost towns, destroyed lives were in the wake of the gold rush collapsing. And so the only recourse, the only economic activity these colonists had was with the United States and California. And that's where this petition became so existential and a realization for the British Empire that they might lose Canada, including the rest of Canada, where there were in 1863, 1864, leading pro-Lincoln figures in government in Ottawa that were championing keeping Canada neutral, like Isaac Buchanan, who I write about. The Laurier, the Les Rouges grouping around the Republicans of Quebec were also in favor of internal improvements, the protective tariff, and keeping Canada independent and neutral in the Civil War. And these were all forces who were advocating creating an independent Republic of Canada, where Britain was finally recognized as the evil beast it was, having orchestrated the Crimean War, the suppression of the Indian rebellions of 1858 to 1859, the Opium Wars, to force free trade down the throats of the Chinese. So finally, Britain was becoming exposed for the evil, devious subterfuge that it always was, and people were becoming smart, including Canadians. And that had to come undone, which was done through the ouster of these patriots and the creation of the British North America Act, which kept America loyal to the Canada loyal to the Crown. So again, these dates are very important. July 1st, 1867, the British North America Act is established, creating a federation of 4 Canadian provinces under British modeled constitution. British Columbia, though, resists joining due in large measure to the vast expanse of land separating it from the eastern confederated colonies. Over 2,000 or more kilometers of space separated BC from the other parts of Canada, and that was a good excuse to not join Confederation, because that is a very strange country with two parts so far separated from each other. It would make no sense. On July 18th, 1868, Rupert's Land, which is the vast private territory separating BC from the eastern colonies, is purchased from the Hudson Bay Company by an act of Parliament in British Canada, establishing this territory as Crown land. So all of a sudden, for pennies on the dollar, an act is passed that forces this private company's area to be turned into federal land of Canada. And now it could be said to the British Columbians that there is no space between you and the East, and thus you have no excuse but to join the Confederation. Though still there was resistance and they did not join. Which brings me to the next point. On May 10th, 1869, the U.S. Transcontinental Railway line is completed, which was begun by Lincoln in 1863, establishing the world's first rail line crossing a continent and opening up both the middle of America to manifest destiny and providing a link California from the Atlantic. Colony of British Columbia benefits enormously from the increased access to trade. June 10th, 1869, a month later, British Columbia's anti-Confederation governor Frederick Seymour dies under mysterious circumstances. So here we have a governor of British Columbia who actually, in my research, is somebody who in secret was a Republican and who was fighting to defend the annexationists to buy them time to finalize their joining of the United States as a new state, which would result in them immediately experiencing rail lines extending northward, up into essentially Alaska that had just been purchased for $7 million by William Seward. So that was clearly going to be the next step, and I'm going to prove that that's the case shortly. So back to the timeline. After he dies, something begins. That's bad. December 10th, 1869, a second annexation petition from British Columbia merchants and politicians is delivered to President Ulysses S. Grant. President Grant and his colleagues make their interests known to the public. So they express their interest to acquire British Columbia. July 20th, 1871, arrangements for British Columbia's entry into Confederation are streamlined. So now all of a sudden, there's a fight. The pro-Confederation figures around Cosmo Amore, who is the new replacement to Frederick Seymour. Frederick Seymour is now brought in and accelerates the joining of BC to the rest of Confederation, which unfortunately prevents the rail connecting Russia and the United States. So again, Rupert's Land was acquired fully in 1870, and 6 provinces were added to the original 4, including Manitoba in 1870, British Columbia, as I mentioned, in 1871, Prince Edward Island in 1873, Alberta and Saskatchewan in 1905, and finally Newfoundland in 1949, creating the boundary conditions of what today is known as Canada. Now, we'll see more of that towards the end of this presentation, but I wanted that to be planted there in people's minds. So now to say something about the question of Russian relations to Alaska and the idea of a U.S.-Russian rail line that would necessitate also Alaska becoming American, or the part of the U.S. Constitution. And here, General Nikolai Muraviev wrote to Tsar Alexander this wouldn't have been Alexander II, this would have been his father, Nicholas, in 1852, foreseeing what would inevitably happen, where he writes that the ultimate rule of the United States over the whole of North America is so natural that we must ourselves, sooner or later, recede. But we must recede peacefully, in return for which we might receive other advantages from the Americans. Due to the present amazing development of railroads, the United States will soon spread over all of North America. We must face the fact that we will have to cede our North American possessions to them. So I mentioned this, but let's look at it. This again is Lincoln's Transcontinental Railway, which was finalized in 1869. It was begun during the Civil War, connecting for the first time a continent that would have connected northward. These were two figures representing Jefferson Davis, Albert Pike, who represented a different view of of how the world should work. And here's a painting featuring Ambassador Stoeckel and William Seward. Stoeckel is standing up with his hand on Alaska on the globe, and William Seward is sitting down with a map, which was a treaty that William Seward described as his greatest success, performed entirely in secret back channels, and that nobody had anticipated until the last moment. Lincoln had expressed in 1864 December speech to the U.S. Congress what he envisioned for the Arctic and for Alaska, Russia, and the USA, where he writes, "The proposed overland telegraph between America and Europe, by way of the Bering Straits and Asiatic Russia, which was sanctioned by Congress at the last session, has been undertaken under very favorable circumstances. Assurances have been received from most of the South American states of their high appreciation of the enterprise and their readiness to cooperate in constructing lines tributary to that world-encircling communication." So Lincoln was explicit that he foresaw the development of economic activity, starting with telegraph lines, again, the activation of the ideas, the discoveries metaphysically of Benjamin Franklin earlier that allowed for the communication by electricity of information, and the condensing of physical space-time in a sense through the acts of mind, the noosphere, Vernadsky's noosphere again in operation, that he foresaw as what would drive first the opening up of the Arctic and also tributary lines as well of rail throughout all of the Americas and broader Eurasia. Some of the allies of Lincoln in Russia included, I've shown this picture in a previous lecture, but it's worth showing again. This shows Sergei Witte, who was the finance minister in 1890 till 1900. He was the transportation minister, and he became also at the same time finance minister. He became the first prime minister of Russia, overseeing the first Duma in 1905. Unfortunately, short-lived due to foreign manipulative intrigues of bankers that wished to see Russia suffer a color revolution and go into chaos. But he was one of the key figures who applied most vigorously Abraham Lincoln's program of the protective tariff, national directed credit, the utilization of debt for the sake not of just simply paying for overhead costs of government, but rather for introducing long-term credit for the development of the physical productive powers of labor, especially driven by what he oversaw, which was, as we see there on the map, the Trans-Siberian Railway, as the world's second transcontinental railway, modeled in so many ways off of the U.S. experience. To the right of him, we see Dmitry Mendeleev, the founder of the discoverer of the periodic table of elements, and a man who became the chairman of the Committee of the Protective Tariff of Russia. He was somebody who visited America and explored the American system and brought back his lessons to apply it in the form of his battles against British free trade and his fight to restore proper credit with a focus on scientific education, mining, development, and opening up the resources of the Arctic, as well as the rail connections to connect the nation, the vast, vast nation of Russia, by efficient roads and rail. We have on the bottom left Finance Minister Ivan Vyazhnegradsky, and the assassinated Tsar Alexander II, the Great Liberator, who were all advocates of this American system in Russia. Here we have two photographs or two images, photographs. One that says a type of locomotive manufactured in the United States for the Trans-Siberian Rail Line. And this was a Baldwin locomotive from Philadelphia that made all of the rail cars for the first Trans-Siberian Rail Line. And on the bottom is a railway on the ice provisional construction train crossing the frozen Irtych River in Russia. So again, American engineers helped come down to participate with their Russian brothers in building this. You had American uh, economists who went down as well to help support and guide this with their Russian counterparts together as friends and allies for this new idea of a society founded upon land-based development and cooperation. And it wasn't new. This is not something that just appeared through the Civil War. This was a relationship that had begun even earlier. America had made itself prominent as one of the earliest embracers of rail steam engines in the 1820s. And that gained the admiration of lovers of progress in Russia, including Tsar Nicholas II, who in 1842 hired George Washington Whistler to come to Russia and help oversee the construction of Russia's first railway, the Moscow to St. Petersburg Railway featured in the image on the bottom left. So this was already something that had been arranged by the diplomacy that we had seen by figures like John Quincy Adams, America's found ambassador to Russia, who had a special relationship with Tsar Alexander I, who asked him to even be his godfather to the Tsar's son, which he had to decline for diplomatic reasons. But he was a great friend of Russia and helped build up strong networks of bonds, even amidst difficult and trying times like the Napoleonic Wars and the Congress of Vienna. But still, there were forces on both sides working to keep that alliance alive. I mentioned quickly that Mendeleev was in America. This was where he came, was 1876, the U.S. Centennial Exhibition, which featured countless thousands of scientists, of engineers, of diplomats from all around the world who came to the United States over several months, where this was sort of a world's fair of sort, showcasing how America was able to increase and multiply their population in numbers, but also in quality, and how this young nation was able to outproduce the British Empire in almost every domain of economic activity, how it was able to survive a wasting civil war and come out stronger than ever. How did that happen? And here we have a large engine being featured at one of the displays. And it was designed as well by one of the key organizers. It was Lincoln's economic advisor, Henry C. Carey, who was the major organizer of this event, who invited the world's leading scientists and diplomats in order to educate them on protectionism, how to resist British free trade, what is national banking. And you could read the pamphlets that Henry C. Carey and his allies were publishing that spread all over this exhibition to get people to realize that if you want to have a full spectrum economy and be fully economically sovereign, you needed to have a system of national political economy with these characteristics that would define money and value as being tied to future productivity and specifically new discoveries and inventions. Extremely important, the relationship of mind to matter and the conditioning of the behavior of money, of investment towards those ends, which are more than money. They're more than business. They're more than matter. They're tied to those principles that we saw in the Declaration of Independence that apply to all humankind and not simply English white people. Now, the post-1876 spread of the American system, it was global. There were allies. There were American advisors, allies, and experts of Lincoln who were brought into Japan, help guide and advise the Meiji Restoration after the Civil War. And here I feature, as the principal genius of that list, Erasmus Peshine Smith, who published many works on the American system for the Japanese, and that oversaw helping Japan build up railways as well, and assisted them in the use of national banking practices and protectionism, which unfortunately became corrupted as the British got in and helped groom a militarized, more militaristic samurai ideology faction of the Japanese to begin to become their martial lord, to be used and weaponized in battles against Russia, against China, which we saw in the 1890s, all the way up till 1904, where 70% of the Russian battle ships navy were wiped out by a concerted attack, which the Emperor of Japan even awarded Jacob Schiff, one of the key American bankers, with the Order of the Rising Sun, which was the highest order you could give as an award to a non-Japanese for his work in giving $20 million to the Japanese that were needed to help them build up their war machine. And again, that was done under the direction of the British Empire that provided the support, means to carry all of that out. But again, 1876 earlier was a different time with greater hope and greater potential. We had in France Gabriel Hanotaux, the foreign minister, and President Sadi Carnot, who were bringing in Lincoln's system into France. We had Otto von Bismarck's customs union, his Zollverein, which brought this into Germany to unify and industrialize Germany as a singular nation in ways that had never been done before. We had in Russia the application that I mentioned, and in Argentina, the Drago reforms were also done at the 19th century, applying Lincoln's system of constitutional banking to prevent the further destruction of the Argentine economy. Count Sergei Witte stated in 1890 his philosophy of railroads, noting that the railroad is like a leaven, which creates a cultural fermentation among the population. Even if it passed through an absolutely wild people along its way, it would raise them in a short time to the level requisite for its operation. He said later on, talking about how he was able to build the Trans-Siberian Railway, he describes saying, faced by a serious shortage of locomotives, I invented and applied the traffic system which had long been in practice in the United States and which is now known as the American system. Very self-conscious application. He was also a translator of the works of Friedrich List, who was a German who brought in the American system into Germany and refuted Adam Smith's free trade. He was probably murdered, but his work on the national system of political economy and the American system was translated extensively into Russia, and Witte was one of the key translators and promoters who gave many lectures on this system, even when he was working to try to save the Romanovs at the last minute later on, after it was becoming clear that the foreign-directed Bolsheviks would uprise once again. And he began even working with his sometime enemy, Rasputin, to try to avert a tragedy. And these two men, who became allies towards the end, failed and saw a tragedy unfold that didn't have to happen. Otto von Bismarck in 1876 noted to the Russian parliament, or the German parliament, he gave a speech describing his admiration of the United States, which he had come to emulate economically, where he wrote that a success of the United States in material development is the most illustrious of modern time. The American nation has not only successfully borne and suppressed the most gigantic and expensive war of all history, but immediately afterwards disbanded its army, founded employment for all its soldiers and marines, paid off most of its debt, given labor and homes to all the unemployed in Europe as fast as they could arrive within its territory, and still by a system of taxation so indirect as not to be perceived, much less felt. Because it is my deliberate judgment that the prosperity of America is mainly due to its protective laws, I urge that Germany has now reached that point where it is necessary to imitate the tariff system of the United States. And on the left is a painting of President William McKinley, who cited this speech to the U.S. Congress when he was pushing his protective tariff, modeled on Lincoln's example, which guaranteed a protection of nascent industry against the dumping of cheap goods from abroad, which was one of the tools of economic warfare engaged in by the British to keep nations underdeveloped. And so this was something that both Bismarck and McKinley also fought for. Bismarck, unfortunately, was fired due to certain court intrigue that was tied to British agents in the German court, some of which is documented in my books. His ouster resulted in a loss of wisdom and statecraft in Germany, and with that vacuum of wisdom that he left in his midst, all of a sudden the Kaiser and his bad advisors began to make bad decisions, resulting in ever increasing steps into traps that were laid for them, ultimately leading up into World War One, and then even two. McKinley, by the way, like uh, Tsar Alexander II, was murdered by an assassin, an anarchist assassin, that was tied to Emma Goldman, a member of the British Neo-Malthusian League who had her own commune, a cult, with brainwashed victims who could be deployed to carry out bombings and murders of statesmen or crowds, whomever. This was the case across Russia and Europe as well. This is what killed President Sidi Carnot. It's also what killed Garfield earlier through a stooge who had been groomed in one of these communes in northern state New York, was deployed to murder President Garfield, who was another follower and admirer of Lincoln. Even in China, we had President Sun Yat-sen, who became the first president of the Republic of China in 1911. And that's a commemorative stamp with the face of Sun Yat-sen and President Lincoln saying, of the people, by the people, for the people. And the three principles of the people that were outlined by Sun Yat-sen, modeled on his studies of Abraham Lincoln, which he outlined in his book on the principles of the people, where he says, the world has been greatly benefited by the development of America as an industrial and a commercial nation. So a developed China with her 400 millions of people will be another new world in the economic sense. The nations which will take part in this development will reap immense advantage. Furthermore, international cooperation of this kind cannot but help to strengthen the brotherhood of man. And I included that because I want people to just be aware that the idea of focusing on the viable America, there's two American traditions that are in opposition. America is not simply an evil empire, as so many have wished to hold on to. There is a deeper, more beautiful, legitimate tradition, which was understood by these great statesmen from Sidi Carnot and Alexander II and III, and President Sun Yat-sen and Bismarck, that saw that there was something universal expressed in the case study of America that applies to all people, independent of their religion or language or geographical location. And it is tied to the idea, the concept of breaking free of empire into a new age of brotherhood of humankind. The man who thought very much on these levels was a figure here named William Gilpin, the first governor of Colorado Territory, who lived between 1813 and 1894. I should have mentioned as well that Sun Yat-sen was trained in Hawaii, and there studied the American system, and was brought also to the United States as a young man by a special relationship that was created in the 1870s under Ulysses S. Grant between the USA and China that gave favorable nation status to each other and made it very easy for young Chinese to come and train and learn in America, as one aspect of this treaty. This was the Seward-Burlingame Treaty that I'm referring to. It was overthrown in the 1880s, and racist anti-China policy was put forth that saw Chinese only useful as slave labor for high-risk employment in building railways. And many died. But before that, there was a more noble U.S.-China policy that is worth studying today, and which Sun Yat-sen benefited from, which is why he came and studied in America before leading the fight of overthrowing hereditary systems in China itself. Now, Gilpin, as I mentioned, was also, in previous lecture, was the founder of what's known as the cosmopolitan railway design, a grand strategic design for railways stretching around the world, uniting the continents around the Bering Strait, stretching all the way across Africa, the Darien Gap, Eurasia, which he wrote about extensively in the last magnum opus that he published in 1890. And this is something that was already in there was a dialogue in different parts of the world around the need for this sort of thing. And he writes, in his own words, describing his vision of this future that he foresaw as being possible even within his lifetime, writing that railways continue to extend themselves, soon to become a universal system all over all the lands of the globe. We have seen the energies of the American people bringing into line and into use these new powers, span their continent with Pacific railways, as with the rapidity of lightning from a mountain loud. They will continue to expand their work to Bering Straits, where all the continents are united. This will extend itself along similarly propitious thermal selvage of the oriental Russian coasts into China, to prolong this unbroken line of cosmopolitan railways along the latitudinal plateau of Asia to Moscow and to London will not have long delay. The less significant and isolated continents of the southern hemisphere, South America, Africa, and Australasia, will be reached by feeders through Panama, Suez, and the chain of oriental peninsulas and islands. The whole area and all the populations of the globe will be thus united and fused by land, travel, and railway. The weapons of mutual slaughter are hurled away. Sanguinary passions find a check. A majority of the human family is found to accept the essential teachings of Christianity in practice. Room is discovered for industrial virtue and industrial power. Civilized masses of the world meet. They are mutually enlightened and fraternize to reconstitute human relations in harmony with nature and with God. The world ceases to be a military camp, incubated only by the military principles of arbitrary force and abject submission. The new and grand order in human affairs inaugurates itself out of these immense concurrent discoveries and events. And this is just simply grand vision, which showcases what one of many statesmen who were thinking on this higher level envisioned for a more natural world founded upon natural law and was based on cooperation, not warfare or plunder. That was something that was understood as tied to the material challenge of ending hunger, creating the basis of cooperation as a higher function through rail development and interconnectivity. Tsar of Russia in the New York Times, March 27th, 1906, reports that the Tsar of Russia has issued an order authorizing the American syndicate represented by Baron Loic de Lobel to begin work on the Trans-Siberian Alaska Railroad project. Plan is to build a railroad from Siberia to Alaska by bridging and tunneling the Bering Strait. It is said that the enterprise will be capitalized at from $250 million to $300 million, and that the money centers of Russia, France, and the United States will be asked to take bonds. Now, this was something which a team of engineers had gone, they carried out feasibility studies. This was largely Sergei Witta's efforts to end the pressure cooker, the pressure that had built up in against a lot of the peasant population, which he could see were being radicalized and weaponized as mobs that could be used to create chaos. But to end, in order to create those anarchist mobs, that required economic suffering, pressure, fear. And he knew that if you could end that fear, end the suffering by granting more democratic powers to the people to participate, this was the basis of the Duma, that could provide economic opportunities, then people would not have the reasons that they felt they needed to overthrow a government. And so one of the grand designs, the bigger you can think into the future, the greater the good that will eventually blossom. This was one of the greatest ideas that could be pondered, was the Bering Strait rail tunnel. Now, again, unfortunately, we know that an age of chaos emerged in the wake, and this future did not come into being at that time. Instead, we had an age of assassinations and controlled wars. Kicking over the chessboard was the nature of the British game when it was becoming clear that the British Empire was not going to be able to survive in an age of cooperating full spectrum economies and nations. So after Lincoln was murdered in 1865 for his second inauguration, you had Alexander II murdered in 1881. You had President Garfield murdered by an anarchist in the same year, 1881. Otto von Bismarck was ousted in 1890. President Sidi Carnot was assassinated in 1894. Tsar Alexander III was most likely poisoned by arsenic, and a very talented doctor has recently written up, a good friend of mine, his assessment of that arsenic poisoning and the diagnostics he had for the Tsar, looking at the descriptions of the Tsar's symptoms. President McKinley was assassinated in 1901. Von Plev, a Russian minister of the interior, assassinated in 1904. Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia was assassinated February 17th, 1905. I would also say the Spanish king was also assassinated, somebody who was in favor of development. You had an Austrian princess who was also assassinated during this time. You had Tsar Nicholas II, we all know, was murdered with his family on July 17th, 1918. And President of China, Sun Yat-sen, was forced to step down after less than 1 year in 1912 and may have been poisoned. He died a very premature death later on. That is the end of this class, but I want to just add a little addendum because this tragedy, this potential of a beautiful world actualizing the ideals of 1776 was sabotaged once again. And I'm doing this with a look to our current situation because there are parallels in our current day that cannot be ignored. And especially the role of Canada as a wedge between US-Russia cooperation. And I've mentioned already the battle for British Columbia. I want to go into a little bit more detail as the addendum to this lecture. I already showcased this, but let's look at it again. At the time of 1867, most of Canada was Hudson's Bay land. Now, I pointed out that American consul Alan Francis wrote to Washington, noting the political climate in British Columbia, where he noted that the colonists claiming most loyalty to the Queen are now urging with great unanimity annexation to the United States as their only salvation, as the only means of retrieving the colonies from their present embarrassment and decline. I already mentioned he was looking at a British Columbia in economic disarray and despair. In the colonist newspaper of 1867, one of the most popular newspapers of British Columbia, it describes, since no change would be for the worse, they, the British Columbians, would welcome annexation to the United States, to continuing in a state of poverty and wretchedness. In writing this, we know we speak the mind of 9 out of every 10 men in the colony. The sentiment is heard at every gathering street corner, at social gatherings, in business circles, in all places. I didn't mention this, but the reason why I'm choosing to make this the addendum is because currently there is so much discussion about Canada becoming a 51st state under President Trump's rhetoric, and that may or may not be a good thing. I'm reserving my judgment, but it's important to appreciate these historical battles around Canada and what has actually been the British hand manipulating Canada at the expense of the USA for so long. I will not read the annexation petition of 1869 submitted to Queen Victoria, but at the very end, in bold, it does say, "For these reasons, we earnestly desire the acquisition of this colony by the United States," which, of course, Victoria says no. In 1871, there was a, 1871, there was the first major international trial at The Hague that ruled in favor of America against Great Britain for Britain's role in illegally supporting the Confederacy by providing warships that were used by the Confederacy, although Britain was nominally neutral. That's a little image there of John Bull encouraging one of the captains of SEMS to fire at American Union ships with a picture of a coin in his eye, since Britain made a lot of money off of this, but at the same time, they didn't do it for money. They did it to destroy the Union. And it says here, November 1862, Harper Weekly's cartoon featuring John Bull calling for the destruction of the Yankees. So what had happened was that this trial that was led by President Grant, who defended America in its legal fight against Britain, Grant himself had called for, while doing this, at the same time he called for acquiring British Columbia, where he says the only remedy for the evils which beset us, we believe to be in a close union with the adjoining states and territories. We are already bound to them by a unity of object and interest. Nearly all our commercial relations are with them. They furnish the chief markets we have for the products of our mines, lands, and waters. They supply the colony with most of the necessities of life. They furnish us the only means of communication with the outer world. For these reasons, we earnestly desire the acquisition of this colony by the United States. So he was openly, as the president, supporting this. And William Seward, the Secretary of State, as well as Senator Charles Sumner, who were, I would say, some of the biggest advocates of ending British control over North America, said no, instead of Britain paying a fine of $15 million as penitence for their support militarily of the Confederacy, instead of them paying a fine, we demand the full acquisition of Canada instead, which would have turned all of world history in a very different direction. However, that didn't happen, and for whatever reason, the money was taken instead. But it was clear, though, that there was a need, and I mentioned here the race to consolidate and create the Confederacy. This is one of the celebrated founding fathers of Canada, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, Sir John A. Macdonald, kissing the hand of Queen Victoria, and who had said famously, a Britisher I was born, and a Britisher I will die. The founding fathers of Canada are a much weaker, cowardly sort compared to those of the United States. And here is John A. Macdonald, and a quote he delivered in 1867, saying that I would be quite willing personally to leave the whole country a wilderness for the next half century. But I fear that if Englishmen do not go there, then the Yankees will, describing his belief that he needs to build rail lines across Canada to connect British Columbia to the Atlantic. But he prefers not to do it. He doesn't love progress. He does it as a necessary evil, recognizing geostrategically that Canada would be lost if this doesn't happen. Another founding father of Canada, a father of Confederation, as they are called, was Sir Alexander Galt, who echoed John A. Macdonald's remarks on March 22nd, 1867, where he said, if the United States desire to outflank us on the west, we must accept the situation and lay our hand on British Columbia and the Pacific Ocean. This country cannot be surrounded by the United States. We are gone if we allow it. From the Atlantic to the Pacific must be the cry in British America as much as it has ever been in the United States. So again, describing the need to create a new propaganda to make Canadians believe that they need to go west in order to protect the British Empire and to stay not American, but not to actually have a true civilization, but simply one that would be a geopolitical wedge separating U.S. from Russian relations. Another founding father is Sir George Etienne Cartier, who wrote in 1865, in this country, we must have a distinct form of government in which the monarchical spirit will be found. Again, asserting that only a society based on hereditary power as the basis of law must be permitted in this land. And finally, in 1885, they finally finished the Trans-Canadian Railway as a reluctant maneuver, which they would have preferred not to have done. The British Empire never simply grants development to its colonies. That is only done to bribe or keep a colony under the control of the empire for a greater evil to be imposed. In this case, it was the ensuring that Canada would never grow as a true nation or as anything similar as Russia had with its opening up of the Arctic. Despite having a similar climate, Canadian territory remains immensely underdeveloped. And finally, the last slide here is a figure who was a leader of something that became known as the Milner Kindergarten or the Cecil Rhodes Milner Roundtable Movement. Perhaps I might do a further lecture on this. A lot of this is in my book, but a new set of think tanks was created at the end of the 19th century within England to do some reorganization because it was becoming clear that the British Empire was no longer relevant and could no longer compete with the emergence of sovereign nation states in cooperation around large scale projects. And so one of those think tanks was known as the Fabian Society of misanthropic, eugenics loving transhumanist, what became later on transhumanists later on, but at the time they were still known as eugenicists. These groups of Fabian socialists created the London School of Economics. They had such members as Bertrand Russell, um, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, Lord Maynard Keynes, and many others who all shared the common quality of being devoted to rebuilding the British Empire under a one world government, reacquiring the United States under the control of the British Empire or under some Anglo-American special relationship, and reducing world population by a master class of elites. That was their philosophical worldview. And they worked closely with another think tank that I mentioned, the Roundtable Movement, that worked out of Oxford and that brainwashed young talent in the form of Rhodes scholarships that were given to talent to be brainwashed in Oxford and then sent back to their different parts of the world to be a part of a multi-generational uh, infiltration and takeover of target nations in the form of what George Bernard Shaw developed as permeation theory. Now, Lord Alfred Milner could see that Canada was in danger once again of sliding away, and a pro-Lincoln leader had come to power named Wilfrid Laurier as prime minister. And Laurier had worked very hard over many years to build what was known as a North American Zollverein of the US-Canada relation that would be under a protective tariff and that internally would be driven by large-scale economic development, infrastructure, and entrepreneurialism. That idea is not like NAFTA. People hear that and sometimes they think, oh, that's the North American Free Trade Agreement. That is not the same thing at all. This earlier one was driven by the ideas um, of Alexander Hamilton, of Friedrich List and the German Zollverein, the German Customs Union, and Abraham Lincoln. So it was a different idea, different philosophy, and that had to be thwarted. It had to be stopped. And Alfred Milner came to Canada with Alfred Mackinder from the London Fabian Society, the founder of modern geopolitics. They both came together and they both came up with a battle strategy to keep Canada controlled and not independent. Ultimately, Wilfrid Laurier was overthrown by a coup d'etat that was run by the Roundtable Movement that he talked about after he was overthrown, and some Freemasonic operations in Ontario's Orange Order. That's in my book. But Lord Milner wrote in 1909, before Wilfrid Laurier was overthrown, describing what to do with this thing called Canada. And he says, egotistically, as between the three possibilities of the future, number one, closer imperial union, which is closer union between Canada and the rest of the empire under a federation, which was what the Roundtable Movement was devoted to, was imperial federation. Number two, the other scenario, which was union with the United States, that is what Laurier was pushing with a U.S.-Canada special relationship, or just simply joining the USA as another state, possibly. And number three scenario, independence. I believe definitely that number two is the real danger. I do not think the Canadians themselves are aware of it. They are wonderfully immature in political reflections on the big issues, and hardly realize how powerful the influences are. On the other hand, I see little danger to ultimate imperial unity in Canadian nationalism. On the contrary, I think the very same sentiment makes a great many, especially of the younger Canadians, vigorously and even bumptiously assertive of their independence, proud and boastful of the greatness and future of their country, and so forth, would lend themselves, tactfully handled, to an enthusiastic acceptance of imperial unity on the basis of partner states, in quotes. This tendency is, therefore, in my opinion, rather to be encouraged, not only as a safeguard against Americanization, but as actually making, in the long run, a union of all the Britons. And this was acted upon, and what I found in the course of my investigations over the ensuing 60, 70 years was a concerted effort by the followers of Milner in Canada and abroad to create a synthetic identity of Canadian false nationalism that would be based only on the idea that Canadians are not Americans. That would be it. That their identity would be, we are not American. And that would keep them psychologically and spiritually under the iron grip of the deep state that is the crown, that is the Privy Council, that is the shadow government that manages both Ottawa, but also that manages the American deep state as well. When one looks at the continuity and origins of America's deep state, it's connected to the same thing. So that has to be just brought into considerations when we look at what were Franklin Roosevelt fighting. It wasn't just Hitler. It was also something within North America that he was battling and that killed him. As Stalin said, Roosevelt was poisoned to Roosevelt's son, that Churchill's people murdered your father. What was it that John F. Kennedy stood up against and battled when he said that we are going to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the winds, as he was looking to Russia as an ally in building a new relationship of cooperation on space exploration, and other poor countries as partner states like Kwame Nkrumah's Africa as a partner in development of our infrastructure and our well-being together, where JFK helped Ghana build the first and largest hydroelectric dam that was supposed to be the basis of a new industrial renaissance of the 1960s. What killed John F. Kennedy's brother? And what was John F. Kennedy's brother fighting against? What shot Reagan? What was it behind the operation of the lone gunman that nearly killed Reagan in 1981 when he was making maneuvers and back-channel discussions with the Russians to end the Cold War by introducing the Strategic Defense Initiative? What was it that nearly killed Gerald Ford in 1975, who was overseeing the supporting the creation of the Apollo-Soyuz cooperation on space program in 1975? That Gerald Ford, who supported that, who was a weak man otherwise, as was Reagan. But despite that, their human side that was tied to this better tradition and better sense of moral reason of foreign policy was able to come alive. And who would have been president had Gerald Ford successfully been murdered by that praised woman who was a member of the Charles Manson family who just missed? It would have been Nelson Rockefeller as president. Who would have been president if Reagan had been murdered and he had died from his bullet wound in 1981? It would have been President George H.W. Bush. Who was it who has been trying to overthrow the government and create Russiagate, painting Donald Trump as a Russian stooge? It's tied to the exact same Rhodes Scholar operation that involves Rhodes Scholars like Strobe Talbot, who worked so hard to destroy Russia in the 1990s with Al Gore and George Soros and Perestroika. That was the same Strobe Talbot that participated with British intelligence who bring in forged dossiers to begin a witch hunt to destroy Donald Trump in his first term. And they didn't go away. And they're heavily baked into Canada. This is Chrystia Freeland, who's a Rhodes Scholar. Mark Carney is not a Rhodes Scholar, though he might become prime minister, but he is conditioned in Oxford and is loyal to the exact same system. And that system is only being challenged right now in an effective way by the revival of the Gilpin dream of the new Silk Road that has already given new life to the greater Eurasian partnership, the prospect of opening up the Arctic for real economic development and cooperation instead of militarizing the Arctic in preparation for another front of the emerging World War III. The Arctic could be a domain of beauty and growth and cooperation, as we see with the BRICS nations, Russia, China, especially the Polar Silk Road, and the discussions that have been around now for some years to revive the extension of rail lines through the Bering Strait as a driving force of a new world of sovereign national cooperation. So, will Donald Trump bring America on board? He's coming in, he has a second chance to do it. We know that he's already endorsed the US Alaska rail line through that would have connected Alaska to Alberta and down to the lower 48 states, that would have opened up the Arctic for development that doesn't currently have much of anything in the North American zone. Might this be something that he does? Or do the forces of darkness have greater power at this point, and and all that is left is to prepare for a North American technate of empire and war? Is that the direction we're going to go in? Well, the study of history is something that is not based upon dead events of the past, and I hope people recognize now what I've been noting in my previous lecture, that history is a study of futures that did or didn't come into being, and that the present is the history of the future, and that we are living in and creating history both through our actions as well as our lack of actions. That is also part of what is making it. Whether or not we choose to embrace folly or wisdom remains to be seen. Battle is on. We know that there are some nations that have tapped into the better traditions of the human spirit and natural law, and we can only hope that we can do our part to resonate to that while there is still time. So that was a bit of a long lesson, but there is more to come as we go into future courses or future lectures in this course series. And I look forward to seeing you for lecture number 5.